Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. Audiobooks.com is the chief underwriter for Good Books Radio, which is produced by UTRGV Media Services for Rio Grande Valley Public Radio. And now, here's your host, Dr. John Cook.
Welcome once again to another edition of Good Books Radio. I'm your host this week, Dr. John Cook, and with me today is Liz Carlyle. Liz Carlyle is a fellow at the Center for Diversified Farming Systems at the University of California, Berkeley. She holds a PhD in geography, also from Berkeley, and a BA from Harvard University. A native of Missoula, Montana, Carlyle is a former legislative aide to United States Senator Jon Tester, one of my personal heroes. Liz, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, John. My pleasure.
This is a great story, and I want to get into the representation of American individualism fighting at a high level for what's right, which is how I saw this as I read it. But I did want to talk about your author's note at the beginning, because when you started out on this journey to find out more about all this, you had retired from country singing, and you were loading up a car with gas with your last dollar. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I've always been real interested in the stories that farmers told about the work that they did and where that sort of leads as a philosophy about working with the land, doing something for the sake of your community. So my first career in this was as a country singer, to be a storyteller about rural America, essentially. And I was really captivated when people, along the course of my travels, would tell me about where they got their land ethic, why they were a farmer, what they'd learned from their parents and grandparents about it. But I was also hearing these stories about what was wrong in the food system, and that, yes, they wished to take care of their land, but really at the end of the day it was the grain elevator that told them what to plant, and these things were wrong with the farm bill, and all these issues that were economic and dealing with policy. So that's why I quit my career as a country singer, was to try to help out with some of those things. I did go to work for Senator Jon Tester. He was an organic farmer from my home state of Montana who had some really compelling things to say about how to recenter the food system around human health and the health of the environment. And then through him, I started meeting all these farmers who were really trying to address the problem. But, what I was seeing with this career as a country singer, filling up the gas tank was, I just felt like I wasn't so much part of the solution yet. I was still stuck in kind of some older paradigms, and part of that was driving around a lot of miles on fossil fuel. But also just, seeking that connection with really, really wise people from my home state who were trying to change things for the better.
Mm-hmm. Now, I will have a hard time being objective about big food, but the massive corporations that have basically taken the game away from the farmers, sinking them into debt while making an awful lot of money off what they are serving the agribusiness to do. It's horrifying to me, and I think the thing that's said in the foreword about the culture of instant gratification seems to be driving what we do in the food industry, regardless of how it affects the long-term future of the agribusiness, of our health, of the cleanliness of our waterways, all of that.
Yeah, and I think what you said is spot on about the power and the money over the last 50 years in the food system have really concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. We have just a handful of international corporations engaged in most of the processing, also a lot of consolidation in retail. So farmers find themselves not really getting a very big share of the dollar that you pay at the grocery store. Most of that money is accumulating in those corporations that are engaged in processing and marketing and sort of in the middle of our food system. And farmers are having a really tough time making a living. So what was inspiring to me about this story is this was a group of farmers who said, we want to take this food system back, and we believe that we can build an alliance with eaters who will purchase our products directly from us and will support us in growing crops that are healthy for our land, that they also know are healthy for their bodies.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about how the system came to be as it is, because after the Great Depression, half of Montana's banks had crashed. The homesteaders began to put their faith in science and begin to apply synthetic nitrogen fertilizers to increase yields, and the herbicide 2,4-D. The weeds went away, and they were liberated from the drudgery of cultivating tractors. But there's an awful lot of negative after effects of better life through chemistry, I guess.
Yes. Yeah, I think what we saw a lot of in the mid-century in Montana and really across American agriculture was a number of solutions that turned out to be short-term. And I can understand, and I've heard people describe, what an epiphany it felt like that you would spray a chemical and the weed would just die. It was gone. But then, of course, it would come back, and a series of other weeds would grow that you hadn't had problems with before, and then the price of the chemical would go up, and you were now dependent on it. So there was this cycle that developed a certain dependency on the industries that were supplying these farm inputs, as well as the industries which were connected, which were then purchasing the farm produce on the other end. And so, as I've heard it described, farmers started to feel less like independent farmers and far more like they were sort of working in an outdoor factory where someone else was really dictating many of the aspects of what they were doing.
And we don't want to leave out Nixon's Secretary of Agriculture, Butts, because he said a couple of things that sort of set us on the path we were on at that time. One of them, go ahead.
Yes, we've hit on a favorite topic for both of us here. Plant fence row to fence row was one of them, and get big or get out was another one of them.
That's it, get big or get out. That's sort of, I, when I listen to John Cougar Mellencamp's song about this, I cry sometimes about what we lost when we lost the family farm.
Yeah, we lost rural communities. That policy was very hostile to rural economies and rural communities. It was quite devaluing of people on this land. It was a sense that the best use for this land is to plant it, literally every single acre with a commodity. There was no notion that there was a role for rural people and schools and churches and small businesses. This was all to be crowded out to make room for, a couple more rows of soybeans or corn or wheat. And yes, very, very sad for those communities.
Now, Montana's a tough place to be a farmer, isn't it? Because of the short growing season and the difficulties that one faces every day, and the hail, the soil erosion. There's many difficulties that farmers face.
Yeah. So 100-day growing season, only about 14 to 18 inches of rain a year, not close to any kind of metropolitan market. You're talking 700 miles to Seattle, a little bit longer to Minneapolis or to Denver. So when this group of farmers started to think about going organic in the 80s, they were looking at Californians and saying, we don't have all these advantages. We don't have the sunshine, we don't have the irrigation, and we don't have an urban population where, we can just go to a farmer's market. So in order to get off of this chemical cycle and this sort of commodity trap, they had to figure out a way that they could grow their own rotation that would support itself within their climate restraints. And that was where lentils came in.
And let's start with the first hero you introduced. Dave, do you pronounce that name Oien?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oien came in, and he was one of these hippies who returned to his home in Missouri for a lot of reasons. But the first thing he started was kind of a small-scale renewable energy effort.
Yeah, that's right. I wish I had been there at the time. Here's this guy grown up on the family farm in Conrad, Montana, a pretty conservative place, had gone off to college, and he comes home when he's 27 with this plan to put solar panels on the roof of his parents' farmhouse. And he's saying, we don't need the chemicals, we don't need the chemical industrial complex. We can grow our own energy and, supply also the energy from our own food, just harvesting, from the sun, whether it's from the solar panels or from photosynthesis. And he's described the look on his father's face when he said that, but I sure would have liked to have been there.
I can well imagine that there might be a little doubt in some of that, right? This notion...
his father was not only a farmer, he was a self-taught certified public accountant. And, his wild-eyed, long-haired son had some work to do to convince him that was going to provide, a reasonable livelihood.
One of the other aspects of Missouri is that it's pretty much a one-crop state. I mean, it's wheat, barley. It's grain. And when even the thought of some other weird crop, some oddball crop, would be shocking to his dad. But this notion of converting their farm from a fossil fuel-based grain monoculture to a self-supporting diversified farm, including using cow manure as an energy source, was probably more than most people could believe.
Yeah, but what was so interesting about this and other movements that I've seen is that this was kind of horrifying to his father, but somewhat familiar to his grandfather. That, we don't have to go that far back in American farming history to see some of the same principles. Certainly not as far along in terms of, how well they had been realized, crop rotation and crop livestock integration. But, Dave's grandfather was familiar with this idea that there was a local dairy and people had their own chickens and their own vegetable gardens. Farms used to be far more diverse by necessity because they were supplying food for the household and for the community.
Mm-hmm. And some of Dave's efforts weren't as fruitful as others. I mean, his first effort was in organic beef, and that ran into several blockades, didn't it?
Yes, yeah. He was a little too far ahead of his time on that one. This is the early 80s, and that was his first idea, is an organic grass-fed beef operation. But at the time, organic by definition meant not livestock. So it was not actually legal to label a product organic and have it be USDA approved as beef, because when you went through the USDA approval process for any kind of livestock product, all of the labeling language had to be approved by the USDA, and they had no approved definition of organic for a meat product. So it was literally illegal for him to sell organic beef.
Mm-hmm. It makes it kind of tough to take it to market, doesn't it?
Yes, yeah. And so now he's thrilled to see, of course, time went by and things did work out with him with lentils, and he's working with many other farmers now. Some of those farmers do have grass-fed organic beef operations, which now is something, of course, you can do legally, and I think kind of a crack-up for him to see that people have caught up to the idea that might be a good idea.
Well, let's introduce some of these organizations that figured into the building of this community of renegade farmers for lentils. One of them is the Alternative Energy Resource Organization, AERO, which Dave joined in '79, I think. And they were meeting and helping people look at the possibilities of renewable energy and using less of the stuff that pollutes our air and causes climate change and so on. Right?
Yeah, and this was a rural citizens group that started in Montana because there was a proposal to build a really large coal capacity in southeastern Montana where there were a lot of family ranches. And people realized that this was going to make it impossible for anybody to do agriculture because the land would be destroyed for that purpose. So people got together and organized, and they defeated a lot of these proposed coal plants. But at the same time, they said, well, if we're going to say no to this fossil fuel economy, we need to have an alternative proposal. So they started working on renewable energy, and they said, the way we have a sun-powered economy isn't just our energy economy. We really need a solar agriculture too. So this notion of not using a lot of chemicals on the farm, but utilizing photosynthesis, whether that was going to be a livestock manure fueled system, or whether that was going to be a rotation crop from the bean family, like lentils, that could supply the fertility to the farm.
Mm-hmm. Now I know that they for some time had alternated alfalfa, but it didn't have the wonderful qualities that lentil has to bring nitrogen out of the atmosphere and put it back in the soil. But there were some radicals, some weed farmers, as we call them, who were looking at how this might be possible.
Yeah, well, alfalfa did have the nitrogen-fixing property as a legume, but what it didn't have was the cash crop potential. So, the problem for people, if they didn't have livestock, particularly, was that they needed to have a crop that would supply the soil with nitrogen, but that they could also earn a living from. So that was what was so wonderful about lentils, is that they left some nitrogen in the soil, but you also had a harvestable food crop off of that. Mm-hmm. So, maybe you would have alfalfa at one point in your rotation if you had a hay market or if you had livestock, but that's a pretty low-value crop typically, certainly in Montana. And so then, instead of having to wait until the next alfalfa crop that you could afford to grow to supply nitrogen, you could have a lentil crop in the rotation. And that would help get you through. It's an annual crop, but it has a lot of those properties that the perennials have of being able to resupply some nutrients.
One of the other significant players in this drama is Montana State and their agricultural college. And one of the issues was that most of their research was funded by big food, by the agribusiness chemical companies, and that made it kind of hard to get research done through the university.
Yes, yeah, and I think, like many land-grant universities in the 1980s, Montana State just did not at all take seriously the notion of organic farming. This was basically just something hippies did for fun, I think, is kind of the perception of it, and the notion that this would be a viable way to earn a living. They just really didn't believe that yet. I think they had to see the proof in the pudding on that one. Mm-hmm. So it's a good thing that this group of farmers came together, really did their own science with the help of a couple renegade researchers, and after some time, I think did convince much of the research establishment that, hey, this is a good idea. This is better for the environment, for one, but it's also an access to a higher value market of people who want to pay a little bit more money to have healthier food.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's look at the miracle plant for a moment. The first miracle plant, the black medic. This was a plant that most gardeners hated, and yet this became part of the solution to organic gardening, didn't it?
Yeah, this is just another unbelievable scene that I wish I had been there for. This is a plant that people knew as a lawn weed that this group of farmers rediscovered as a cover crop, as sort of a natural fertilizer, if you will, that they would actually grow in the understory of their grain crop. So they're going around, promoting the notion that you would take this plant that people know as a lawn weed and purposefully put it in your farm field. Mm-hmm. And, they had a lot of great research to back this up, and folks were doing it in Australia, but, they had these housewives who were staring them down. No way you're going to plant this on our farm. It's bad enough in my lawn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it has certain unique properties. The legumes, the seeds are so tough that some of them don't germinate the first year. They germinate a year later, right?
Right. Yeah, so this black medic was a self-reseeding cover crop. So, if you got the system right, and people were doing this successfully in Australia, and they were using sheep as well to graze it down, which was part of it, but, you don't have to work that hard to grow your own fertility, essentially. Self-reseeding, this is a plant. So it's just a very different paradigm than having to purchase a chemical and apply it on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm. So here's this guy, this innovator who's doing renewable energy, Dave, and he's a black medic farmer, and he gets something from that, and he's trying to sell these green manure seeds to other people, and that was a hard sell sometimes, I think.
Yes, yeah. Well, his market for selling organic cover crops, which is a fertility solution for organic farmers, was other organic farmers, in the region. Well, this is the late 1980s, so other organic farmers in the region, that was like he could count that on his two hands, and that was about all there was. So he had foreseen that organic farming would have to boom because he felt, given the environmental limitations of the industrial model, people were just going to have to make this transition. And that's happened now. And now it's a $35 billion industry, and there are people in business to sell cover crop seed. But the rest of the world wasn't moving quite as fast as he was, so he had to change the business model a little bit.
Mm-hmm. So as Dave is continuing with his adventure, he meets some really good partners that make this community what it was. And let's start with Bud Barta, who was primarily, I guess, responsible for doing the medicine show for them.
Yeah, well, as part of this group, AERO, the Alternative Energy Resources Organization that was working on sustainable agriculture and renewable energy, one of their media, if you will, was doing this sort of traveling variety show. So they would go to rural communities and do these sort of theatrical demonstrations to get people excited about renewable energy and sustainable agriculture. And this really soft-spoken guy from a conservative cattle town got caught up in all of this because he had carpentry skills. He was kind of the handyman for the show. But it just totally inspired him. And he decided, much like David, that he was going to go back to his family farm and convert it to organic. And this was a tough sell with his parents. They had actually been among the first to convert to chemicals, which wasn't that long ago in the history of these communities. In Montana, that was 50s and 60s when people started using fertilizer and herbicides, synthetic herbicides for the first time. So, his father really identified with that and identified as a progressive, innovative farmer for having started to use the chemicals. And then his son comes home and says, Dad, I think this is a bad idea.
Mm-hmm. And then along comes Jim Barngrover, whose father got sick from exposure to insecticides, and so he brought something important to the party, too.
Right, yeah. He had seen his father get sick, not be able to work, go through this long illness before passing away, and that had really very much set him on this path of alternatives to pesticides. They lost the family farm in Wyoming. He came to Montana because Montana had just rewritten its state constitution to say that the people had a right to a clean and healthful environment. So he thought maybe Montana would be a place that he could pursue this vision of an agriculture without chemicals.
Mm-hmm. Timeless Seeds got formed, this company, to sell this product. And they had a lot of audacity but very little capital, you mentioned at some point.
Yeah. I mean, these are a bunch of young guys in their 30s, some of them with a young family, really without anything more than their farms to their name, trying to start a business.
Mm-hmm. And I love it when we add in the junkyard philosopher, Russ Salsbury, because he's a character like I've never heard of before.
Yes. Yeah, that was a real pleasure getting to chat with him.
He found junk stuff and made it his fence, junk tractors and trailers and stuff, and that became like the border of his territory, right?
And he actually uses it to run cattle.
Mm-hmm.
So it's pretty tight fence, actually, for being built up of old trailers and tractors and such.
Yeah, I remember one time, one story in there is that he used to ferry his herd across the Missouri, but that became a problem, and so he took an old yellow school bus and transported them in an old yellow school bus.
Yes, yeah. And then unfortunately he tipped that school bus over one day, and a good Samaritan woman came by and said, "Can I help you?" She imagined there must be school children in this bus. And then she hears all of a sudden, she's next to this bus, this really loud "Whoa!" and just about jumps out of her shoes. So, yeah, there's some characters involved in this story for sure.
Mm-hmm. But this guy had been raising food without chemicals for a while, and he was one of those who didn't like the idea that people want high yields in big numbers. He didn't push for that at all. That wasn't what drove him.
No, and he was an interesting case because he had never converted to using chemicals. He was old enough, he had grown up on a farm that was, preceded the first revolution of, adding chemicals to the farm, and he had never converted to using chemicals. So he had thought, I just must be kind of a stubborn, backwards farmer. He never expected anybody to congratulate him for this way of doing things. He just didn't want to go into debt and made more sense to him for his lifestyle. And then, when the organic movement came along in the 80s and said, this is actually really a good idea ecologically, and there were all these good things about it, and scientists were talking about it, it was real affirming for Russ, to hear that this choice he'd made that made sense to him personally was benefiting other people too, and that he was now part of a larger group of people trying to do a similar thing.
I don't want to go over all this without failing to mention how deep these roots are, because there were organizations prior to this that were part of this grassroots movement. You mentioned a bunch of people in southwest Montana, Bull Mountain, which is home to a son of a member of the Butch Cassidy Hole-in-the-Wall gang, and the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation had released a plan to site 21 new coal-fired plants, and when big coal came in, these guys were determined to stop the strip mining because they wanted to protect their land, and that's fairly rare in America too.
Yeah, but there are these histories of communities that have come together that understand that they're stewards of a common resource that, in a fundamental sense, is what makes their economy possible. So, this was a group of ranchers who understood, if our water ends up dirty, we're none of us going to be able to ranch. And we really value this lifestyle, so we're going to have to come together and talk about this with our neighbors so nobody sells out to coal here. And this goes back even farther back to organizing through the Farmers Union against grain consolidation in the early 20th century. So, I felt like one of the reasons I wrote this book is I would hear people say, oh, you do research in Montana. How do people feel about the organic movement kind of being foisted upon them? And or other people would say, are they finally learning what we know in California? And the truth is, this is a homegrown movement. This comes out of centuries of people organizing, understanding that there was a connection between environment and economy, and wanting to avoid these polluting practices by these large corporations.
And this is a note I scratched in the margin, because as I was reading about the Farmers Union and the Northern Plains Resource Council and, of course, the Alternate Energy Group, I wrote American Heroes, because these were underdogs, and they managed to get legislation passed to protect the environment and make this thing go. And, I'm not even sure we can do that nowadays. I'm glad they did it when they did it.
Yes, I think so too. I think we have good examples to look at, and I do see hope in a generation that is getting politically engaged now, that's thinking about an economy that will be sustainable for themselves and future generations. This is a democracy at all scales, and we do have the ability to come together as a community and take back our economy from multinational corporations.
Well, I hope that happens, because I believe in the individual. We have been talking with Liz Carlyle. This is a fascinating book called Lentil Underground, Renegade Farmers and the Future of Food in America. It's an inspiring story, and we've only touched the surface on the foundations. Wait until you find out how they found that they could actually sell lentils, not just use them to repurpose the soil. It's a fascinating story, an inspiring story, and I hope that everyone will pick up a copy of Lentil Underground by Liz Carlyle. I remind you that if you don't hear our 4 broadcasts per week on 88 FM, you can also catch up with us on YouTube or our Facebook page, Good Books Radio, Strong and Cook. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. Thanks so much for listening.